Thank you for inviting us to be on this dialogue format session. My name is Saara Ratilainen. I am a lecturer in Russian language and culture at Tampere University. And I have the honor to moderate this dialogue here with these two colleagues. The topic of the dialogue is researching history of ideas. And since the previous dialogue conversation already started in this spirit of talking about how concepts have become a bit more central already also in various fields such as history and historical studies. And there comes times when challenging, revisiting, reconsidering the most fundamental concepts and ideas becomes mandatory. So I think we are going to continue in that spirit with two colleagues and scholars in field of history of ideas. We have Liisa Bourgeot and Daniela Munteanu talking about their work and engaging in a dialogue. And we have the same similar structure. So first I'm going to present briefly the speakers or the participants in the dialogue, and then I'll give the floor to Liisa and Daniela, and they'll introduce their fascinating work that they are now doing. And then we go through a few questions, and then, or like in a dialogue manner, and then I'll open the floor to questions, comments from the audience. So I have here Liisa Bourgeot. She's a researcher of Russian philosophy and intellectual history at Alexandria Institute, Helsinki University. In 2021, she defended her doctoral thesis at Helsinki University, focusing on the phenomenological foundations of Gustav Späth's early Soviet cultural theory. She's currently working in the research project Cupola, started this year, right, which studies the possibilities of intellectual and cultural agency under authoritarian rule, in this case, the Stalin era. And then we have Daniela Munteanu. She is a fourth-year PhD candidate in history at the Central European University in Vienna. Daniela studies history of knowledge production in the human sciences, in particular psychiatry and experimental psychology in the late 19th century. In particular, Daniela studies how such concepts as normality, norm, and deviance are being conceptualized, how and why their meanings shift, and how are these eventually employed to categorize and hierarchize people and groups in society. So now I give floor first to Liisa and then Daniela.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, is this normal? Okay. Thank you, first of all, so much to Slavica for inviting me here. It really is not only a pleasure, but really a great honor. I feel like, well, I've been coming here since beginning of my times. I can't remember even, so it really, every time I come here and I walk across this room, it feels like coming home. So it's just a little bit, it's very nice, or at the same time, a little bit strange to be suddenly here, like a center of attention. Have to get used to it a bit. But it's very nice to be part of this celebration. I thought that to get to my topic and the topic that Saara introduced there, I need to talk about myself first. So I'm sorry. I'm going to shortly give like an explanation of how I've come to this point where I define myself as a researcher of Russian philosophy and intellectual history. And all of these terms, as was mentioned also, they have to be taken like with a little grain of salt. And I'm still in the process of figuring out whether this is the right way to define what I'm doing. My path here wasn't entirely straightforward. I was a student of Russian language and literature. My professor Tomi Huttunen is right here. So I was trained as a philologist, mainly. But during my studies, I came across, accidentally somehow, courses of theoretical philosophy, became very interested. And then when I discovered Edmund Husserl and phenomenology, I became really, really very interested, little by little, perhaps a bit obsessed. So when the time came to choose a topic for my master's thesis, it was a tiny existential crisis. Like, how can I write about something that is not phenomenology? And again, there is then just an accident almost. I learned about Gustav Speth, who was an early 20th century Russian or Kiev-born Moscow thinker, who had been a student of Husserl's in Göttingen for 1 year. And I thought, well, here we are. This is my destiny for the rest of my life. I am to study Speth. So I started with Speth, but having no understanding of Russian phenomenology, having no understanding of Russian intellectual tradition, like philosophical tradition in Russia. So it really started from level 0. And I was just so decisive about this is what I meant to do, that, well, I spent the next 10 years studying Speth. Great thanks to this goes to our department, who put up with me and put up with me doing such a strange thing in the field of like Russian literary and cultural studies. Anyway, what this all has to do with what I'm doing now is during my work on Speth, I came across this problem that I would I would say it's perhaps a methodological problem in the field, if not just in my own research. But it was a big problem that I still haven't entirely overcome, and somehow I find that it's at the background of the work that I do today. So in short, this problem is this. Speth, in terms of these, like the time and place and even social surroundings where he worked, he would be often defined, and is often defined, if not always, part of the turn of the century, so-called Silver Age, intellectual, philosophical, cultural phenomenon. But the issue here is that we have very definite understanding of what this means. Like this kind of definition comes with a lot of assumptions of what kind of philosophy is done in that kind of space. So much of it is religious. Certainly most of it is somehow spiritually very driven. There's like this urge to go beyond our lived reality, like to something beyond there, something behind and above, and some kind of like a Platonic reality almost. But yet, in his work, Speth seems to, time and time again, he seems to go against this. He wants to criticize this kind of thinking. He wants to bring something different to Russia. It was not religious philosophy. It was not spiritual philosophy. He wanted to bring like a strictly scientific fashion of doing philosophy to Russia. And though it's called transcendental phenomenology, as Husserl also calls it, it's transcendental in a very different way. It's precisely not trying to go beyond. There is nothing beyond. It's to work with what we have here, our experience, and try to find something there. But the other side of the problem is that still Speth's phenomenology was something a bit strange from Husserl's point of view. Its questions are different. It's clearly coming from another kind of tradition. The motive is different, so the results also are different. And when I tried to then start defining, like, okay, but where is this coming from? What are these questions? Then I didn't have the tools, because I could only refer back to what I had learned, like cultural historically. So perhaps my knowledge was poor, but I couldn't find a way to come to what Speth was actually doing. So this way I came to think that maybe there's something wrong in our narrative of Russian thought, our narrative of Russian intellectual history. It's somehow too restricting, it's somehow perhaps reductive. It doesn't, like, I didn't find the space to ask the questions that I wanted to ask in what I had acquired. So this is, perhaps I'll talk about the current project later, because I've already been speaking so long, but like this is what I'll hope to be doing in the future, is to find ways of recontextualizing these kind of intellectual spaces, not necessarily in that time frame, as Saara mentioned. Now we're working with the late Stalin era, but similar kind of problematic, I find. That's that for now. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Well, it's always nice to face an audience after lunch, but it's never easy with the mic. So, well, thank you again to the Slavica for inviting me to join in the celebration and inviting me to talk and reflect about my work and my relationship with the library. Because after a summer break, it feels like it's so far away. Whatever research I was doing. So briefly, I'm just gonna say what I work on and how the library sort of participated in shaping this project and allow me to choose a direction and ask those research questions. I started studying history professionally or academically only 4 years ago. So it was a high point of COVID. Everything was closed. I couldn't see the inside of a library or an archive until, 2022. And when I started history, for me, the idea of the historian, we were talking with Liisa about it before, was going to the archive, like working in these dusty rooms with documents, coughing dust at the end of the day. So I was so very disappointed that I had to work with digitized materials, and it goes again to digitization and materiality and their role in our research. We talked about that in the morning, and maybe we can come back to that. So I do history of knowledge, history of knowledge production in the human sciences, and more in particular, I look at the knowledge production about self. Or личность in Russian, how two communities of scientists, psychiatrists and experimental psychologists theorize, debate, conceptualize what is a self, what is a normal self, and most importantly, what is this self in relation to will and morality. So I'm looking at this concept of self very much central in Russian thought, and I say Russian thought being very much aware of the multi-layered epistemic frame that this concept is, and maybe again we can come back to that. So when I started putting up the project, I had a list of archives and libraries that I was going to check on in Ukraine and Russia and then Estonia, basically following my sources as a historian. I was trying to follow the heroes of my story, these scientists again that were talking and theorizing of what a self is. And then the war broke up, and I had to look for alternatives, and this is how I ended up in Slavica. And this is how my project kept developing with new questions and new directions. Because this research that I'm doing on the self, I look at it as a form of a dialogue within disciplines, between disciplines, and most importantly, across the empire. I'm looking at how not only the centers, and if for the sake of the discussion we want to think of the centers as St. Petersburg and Moscow, talk to each other, but how the borderlands, how the inlands talk to each other. And this is where the library helped, because I came here and I had this display, this dialogue happening through and across the empire in the various scientific journals and in the various books that I researched. So this helped me a lot in seeing how this concept and how the knowledge produced about this concept travels across the empire through the various publications, how these people talk to each other and how they develop their thought, not only in their publications, but also in their meetings, in their congresses that are being published, and you can find them here, as well as in their obituaries, trying to follow their research, their education, and so on and so forth. So the library helped me understand what to do with my research at the point when no archives, no libraries were available to me. And I think it's the questions, the dialogue that I've eventually developed and then had to narrow down, because the amount of publications that I found here, it's just, it's immense. I mean, I cannot thank enough the librarians and the true friends that kept bringing these dusty books that they haven't seen in a very long time. I remember someone telling me we didn't even know we had this. So I kept taking photos and photos after photos that eventually I spent so many months cataloging and understanding what is going on. And then it goes back to what Simon said at the beginning, how different it is to do research on the computer rather than with an actual material book in your hand. And I miss having the possibility of checking the references in the footnotes, and you don't have that if you have just photos. So basically, yes, I think that the research, my research, and my understanding of self, and the dialogue on will and morality in the empire is such a crucial moment at the end of the century, took shape definitely here, because this is where I could see a zoom in and a zoom out of this conversation happening in the empire. Yes, I think I will just stop for now here. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fascinating, and how you describe your path from kind of starting your PhD project under one crisis and then continuing under another. And this made me think of the question of how the positionality of a researcher, and how that really defines what kind of materials are, what kind of resources are accessible to them, and the time and the place defines that research in that way. And there's now this new generation of scholars who started their PhD under COVID, collected all the materials, like finding new creative ways to work that time, and then finishing up just when that phase was over, and then continuing in a new a geopolitical crisis situation. So it's a very definitive time for those generations of new scholars. And also how one circumstance really keeps you from traveling, you are put in place, and then another situation makes you to travel new direction, to go to new directions, because you cannot travel to Russia, to the archives, but then you can find the materials elsewhere, and then find new ways of looking at your topics. So this is really interesting, and that's why I wanted to kind of go a bit more in detail to your resources. How do you, what sources you used, where you find those documents, those materials, and just describe that a little bit in detail. And then Liisa can also talk about the new project and those sources that you're using for that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, it will give you time to, So I use three different kinds of sources. The published materials that, again, are here in Slavica. I don't go anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And then I have medical records and archival materials. Because in my research, what I'm trying to do is to ground, again, this dialogue, this theorization about what is a self and what is a normal self in this new scientific era at the end of the century. For me, it's very important to ground, again, this philosophical, intellectual dialogue in the actual subjects of the empire. So this is why I go to the hospital, for instance, to see how these psychiatrists that wrote so much about mental health and normality and morality, how did they work with their patients? So I have that part of my sources, and those I found in Tartu, both at the archive and at the hospital, at the mental hospital. And I would have never turned. No, it's not true. I already had that on the list before the war, but I insisted on going there because, again, I didn't have any other choice. But other than that, it's the library. What I did, again, I was very lucky to end up here because I had a list of published journals scientific journals that I wanted to study. So what I did is just I emailed the library asking kindly to let me know if these are here, and Irina here present, she was very kind and took a lot of time to check this for me, and I knew that I will find these things here. But what was better was checking the catalog, the drawers, the catalog. That was the real funding, because there you find things that are not mentioned, in bibliographies, are not checked by other historians in the field. So this is where, literally, wow. I started checking on those unmentioned titles, and this is good because it opens so many paths you can follow, but at the same time it's very difficult, and we'll talk with Liisa about that before, to stop at a certain point and draw the boundaries of your research. but definitely being able to be here, right, to check manually the catalog and to touch, like the journals is very important because digitization, yes, helps a lot. This time space compression definitely allows us to especially if I'm thinking about COVID and the situation now, right? So to reach out to the sources and check them from home. But I think there is a huge epistemological layer, right, in this digitization, like who is digitizing and what is someone digitizing and how, right? It's not about not trusting whomever is digitizing, but about what do you want to see in that page? Are the margins digitized? Are the notes on the margins digitized? I don't know, the turn pages, the angles. I think these are very important details in the work of a researcher. And I think that recently we have a lot of discussion, right, about this philosophy behind digitization, right, and the archival churn and so on and so forth, who is doing what and why. And I think digitization should follow an already established relationship between the researcher and the librarian or the archivist. You've been there, you talk to people, you know how they work, they know how you work, and then you can feel like trusting that, okay, this material will be digitized the way I'm hoping to. But still, I think it's very important that from time to time we had, like get our hands dirty and actually touch what we are looking after. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, so regarding sources, I find what's interesting is that my story with Daniela is rather different. And my whole approach to sources is rather different than previous speakers. I liked very much the previous metaphor of what it feels often to be a historian. So you have you want to go somewhere, you have this peripheral knowledge, as you said, but in the middle there's a black hole and you don't know whether the sources actually exist or not. And then you go somewhere and you discover the sources and you say, wow, well, this is it. I can do the research now. And it fills the black hole. In my case, it was almost the opposite. So what happened is that I had become interested in Spät. I said, okay, what's Spät? And I walk into Slavica and there, boom, a full shelf full of newly mint editions of Spät, all of his works there, ready for me to open and start reading. And I said, okay, well, let's get going. And of course, behind this is the archival revolution that we've mentioned many times here of 1980s and 90s. And this was, for Russian philosophy or philosophy in Russia, this was, of course, huge. This is just a monumental upsurge of new material, how this new, previously forbidden authors and their texts were rediscovered. Many times they had been literally forgotten, like Spät had been removed for decades, and then you go to the archives, oh my God, and there's these treasures, these gems that come out. And I feel that for the most of 1990s and 2000s, this is the work that was done in Russian philosophy, the retrieving from the archives of this material that was lost, and publishing and interpreting and publishing correspondence and diaries, and everything that could be found was published. It's nearly all there now. So this was, of course, a huge intellectual process. And of course, not only was Russian philosophy or philosophy in Russian or Russophone philosophy discovered, but also at the same time, it's like floodgates opened to Western thought that came to Russia. And all of this came together, and the philosophical boom, truly. At the same time, it's of course a national project, since this is a time where, after the empire collapses, this is like a time when Russia has to define itself as a nation, and there's this search for ideas, or maybe one idea that could bring people together. And of course, this was philosophy was utilized in this sense many times, even against its own will, perhaps, or philosopher's own will. But then it was also a personal project for these families who were descendants of the people who had been lost, who had suffered these horrible destinies, and whose work had been lost. So it's very moving. It's very important. You can feel the importance of this work. At the same time, I think it was like in a pretty definitive way, a very uncritical bringing back of text. It didn't want to be critical at this point. You just had to bring it back. So in short, this is like my long excuse for not doing archival research. I find that even if it wasn't for the war, we would be now reaching the point where we have to go back to these texts and reread them and reinterpret them, and when possible, take like a critical start, because I think this is what philosophy is. You take create a dialogue that is critical with the text. There's an interesting parallel that I found recently, a book by Professor Leonid Livak, who was recently in Helsinki actually. I can't remember when the book was published, I think it's fairly recent, where he finds like a somewhat similar phenomenon in Russian modernist studies. He says that, so he is teaching in Toronto, he's teaching Russian modernism to his students, and he had come to think that he doesn't really know what he's talking about. That's what he says in the book. That in a way, this very empirical approach to this question had blindfolded him from some kind of theoretical further questioning. Like he knew all the empirical facts of all of these movements and all of these people, but when it came to like more theoretical discussion, he didn't really like have the toolkit to go into that kind of debate or discussion, like in comparative literature or something. So what he talks about a lot is like a conceptual framework, building new conceptual frameworks for these studies. And Speth falls in that same period, and this is what I try to do. So what I use is published philosophical material and commentaries, and this obviously Slavica has never failed to provide. I mean, there's just everything I need there. 1 and 2 times when the book wasn't here, I can use this amazing kaukopalvelu service where I just tell someone that, look, I'm looking for this book, I can't find it, and they immediately search for it in the nearest foreign library. And just happened last week, I found one such book, and now it's already on its way to me from Graz University, so I find it completely amazing. I think that's about it.
Thank you, and it's really interesting to see kind of your quite different approaches to archives and research materials side by side here, and how still kind of the archives are behind all of us, all of ours work basically, at least who work with historical past times materials. I see that you both go through this really active process of rethinking not just your own projects or your own research or like what you are doing, but like what the whole field is about and what have been the reasons behind why your topic or research field was forming the way it was before, and then also like how is it forming and what directions is it taking from now on. So that's why I wanted to kind of ask, and also maybe kind of reflecting on the time frames or periods that your research coming from, or where your research is located in history, and reflecting on the current moment and this critical reconsideration that we engaging with right now, and what are the now pinpoint a bit more clearly the critical questions or critical questions or concepts, or what you can find in relating in your work and in your field, and also maybe to talk about the researchers' community. How has that been changing, and what directions you might be seeing in that?
Okay, good. So I'm going to start from the last question about what's happening in the field. So we have 2 broad sort of issues, problems, points of discussion: is the access to the archives, which is limited, and also positionality, right? History has been heavily instrumentalized it's always been, but in the past 3 years, is being heavily instrumentalized. And after the full-scale invasion, many historians ask themselves, like, are the narratives that we've been producing and are the epistemologies that we've been producing and the methodologies somehow contributed to what's going on now, to the narrative and to the fact that history is being so instrumentalized? And the discussion now is so I'm going to echo some of the points that we discussed this morning about decentralizing, right? These methodologies, these epistemological frames that we employ in our study, the narratives that we eventually develop, and most importantly, also how we address the archives, right? Because it's not only about going to a non-central archive, right? To a non-Russian written sort of sources. It's also about how we read these sources, right? How, and I'm thinking about Laura Stoller and her like reading along the grain, reading the archives and when we will have access to those archives that we cannot access now, we'll have to change the way we read them, right? Because we have to read, as she said, on the margins, to look for these epistemological anxieties that were there from the center, to see how the subaltern, spoke, even if they did not use the actual written word. So this is one of the of the points of discussion. And then is deconstructing again what we mean when we say Russian, right? Like going back to my first thing, like I'm studying Russian thought, and like walking here this morning, I was just crossing the Senate Square, and I was like, okay, so you studied this concept in Russian thought, and then I stopped for a second, like, but are you really? Like, what is Russian about this Russian thought? And who are these people that were thinking? Were they actual Russians? And what did it mean to be Russian at the end of the turn of the century, right? And I'm thinking that these scientists would probably identify themselves as Russian in the last like sort of moment, because they would identify themselves as scientists, as, I don't know, doctors, as male, so on and so forth, their estate, so it's very important to think through what we mean when we use these terms, this again epistemological frames, because this is what they are, and it goes back also to the question from this morning, like, do we have to rename? I don't know, but it's more about, let's think what it's in the name, right? What it says and what do we mean by that. So to just like conclude, yes, I think that the two most biggest issues, like positionality and decentralizing and questioning those epistemological frames, those methodologies that we employ to go then to the archives and read those sources. Because we necessarily are changing the questions we are asking and again, those lenses that we develop to read the sources, because as we saw, whatever we write or don't is very much being then instrumentalized and used. Yeah.
I like many of the terms you use a lot. Like, I think epistemological framing is very much in place also when we read Russian philosophy. And I said, like, already the term, certainly, Russian philosophy is like to be questioned and to be opened up. And this is a very good question. Like, when we read the text that we have put in the section of Russian philosophy, what is Russian about this thought? Like, what do we mean by it even? And in the field of Russian philosophy, if we now just agree to give it that name for now, there is certainly, I say, an crisis, like an internal crisis going on, which I think is a very good thing. And I think all of my colleagues in this field would agree. I just returned from a week-long conference, which was like a World Congress of Philosophy, where there was a section for Russian philosophy. So all of us researchers of this topic came together happily and spoke for 1 week, and it just would not stop. And everything in the field was questioned within the week, I think. No answers, obviously, but like a lot of questioning. And of course, the whole thing started, I mean, this big question obviously started with the war. Already in 22, there was a collection of articles that came out. There's a center in Bochum, Germany. There's a Professor Nikolai Plotnikov who has taken a very active role in this questioning, who put out a collection called Перед лицом катастрофы, which was like very forceful. It basically, so very different articles, but basically the general sense is that, you know, it's finished, we're done for. Muy uumerli was even said, like this, there must be something so wrong, so poisonous somehow in this intellectual tradition that it has led us to Russian thought to the point where this is the ideology. So of course this is a huge simplification, but this was like the self-canceling culture that came over all of us, also like researchers of Russian culture, I think. Since then, I think the critique and self-critique has become more fine-tuned, more subtle, but also as thorough. And like there are many questions. So what is Russian philosophy? Do we now talk about Russian philosophy as talking about Russia? Because this is a problem of Russian philosophy, like the self-image of Russian thought as something very different, something very specific and different from the West, that has been going on for centuries and in a way just duplicated time after time after time. Should we just call it like Russophone philosophy, trying to talk about just a philosophical tradition within this language area, but then also this, we don't want to leave out philosophy done in somehow the same tradition, but in different languages. And also then there's the question of immigration, both 100 years ago and now. At the moment in the field of research, as Saara was asking, it's certainly being split into two, at least. Huge immigration since 22, a bit before already, and new academic networks, social networks, also academic institutions are being formed. There's now a very active institute of the philosophie indépendante in Paris, which has really become like a meeting place for people who do Russian philosophy, but who have left Russia and are now inagenti in their homeland and cannot do anything there anymore. There's a lot of the people leaving, especially from the Institute of Philosophy in the Russian Academy of Sciences, which is under attack at the moment. People are going into internal immigration in this sense. I mean, it's becoming more and more difficult to, of course you can't speak out freely, but even doing philosophy in a kind of a neutral manner is becoming very difficult, because now there's now like a demand to take like openly ideological stances promoting the war, and they had to start philosophical research projects that support this kind of ideology. And people do this just to survive. So we're going to, how to keep connections to these people is next to impossible. We are leaving them alone in this sense. And at the same time, what will happen? Like, what kind of a strange, separate island of Russian thought is going to be formed by this new Russkoye Zarubezhye is another question. So there's enormous amount of things happening at the same time.
Yes.
Can I just clarify? Sorry, just while listening to you, I just want to clarify a small point. When we say that we have to deconstruct this epistemological frame that Russia is, it doesn't mean that we don't have to recognize. I'm thinking about my own research at the time period, like the turn of the century, that at a certain point there were huge ethnic Russian nationalist tendencies, right, in politics and literature, philosophy, and so on and so forth. That should be acknowledged, but at the same time, you have to make sure that we do not lose sight of the huge and multi-layered and multi-dimensional diversity, subjectivities, and so on and so forth that were present in the empire at the time. So either we come up with new concepts to research and talk about this diversity, about these relationships in the empire, or we make sure we explain what we mean by whatever concept we keep using. Exactly, also because I was thinking about the English language. In Russian, you have a difference between the ethnic Russian and the political, civical, and you don't have that in English, right? So this keeps being perpetuated, this again, this epistemological frame of ethnic nationalism, which again must be thoroughly described and contextualized in order that we also today don't end up essentializing groupness and in general, like the research and the narratives we're building.
Thank Thank you. And now I think very soon I'll open the floor for the audience to engage with this really fascinating dialogue here and this conversation. But my last question again takes this discussion back to the library where we are now and where we started. And it's really interesting to hear like how this conversation is kind of coming from this like really these concepts and ideas and histories to the actual people, and not just us here, but the wider community. And also that we're addressing that question of the people around us, our colleagues, especially in our field, have become refugees of the war in a large scale, and also exile. People have been forced to exile. So their working conditions, institutions, lives, careers have been destroyed in their home countries. And then there is this big movement now. So I'm just thinking what kind of new home, what kind of meeting points, places, libraries could be for these new communities that are forming, and here in Slavica, other places, and how do you see that to affect the future of your research field and the community? Yeah. And then
perhaps just briefly, so that we have time. I think the conference where I just came from, because there are not many places where researchers of Russian philosophy can come together, it just showed how immensely important it is. Like this kind of, when you start redefining a whole field, there's next to nothing you can do alone. It happens in conversation, and you have your own point of view, but then you immediately have to exchange it with others, and everybody has a different point of view to it, and it's just the only way it can happen. And I found it incredibly fruitful. I think with Slavica, what's really special about Slavica is that you get to meet such people from such different fields of such different disciplines and approaches. What's like really, really special is that because it's such an important library for the research, that you basically get the top people of the world. So they just happen to sit next to you in the cafeteria or next, the next tutkijapaikka, and you just start chatting, and it's like there's no way of reaching this kind of conversations elsewhere, I would say. And thirdly, we mentioned this with Daniela earlier, that it's funny with this kind of discipline or this kind of research that is a bit perhaps outside main disciplines, what an influence coincidences have. Like in your case, you come across just materials that you simply didn't know that existed. And I just happened to hear in a way about Spät somewhere in a talk. And like entire research careers are built like we try to make it look like it's like very serious and we've defined it from the start and this is the direction, but actually it's just coincidences leading to other coincidences and, meeting Daniela. So this is how research happens in my mind.
I had a very pessimistic answer, but now I'm just, yeah. Well, definitely, yeah. I think that the conversation, the dialogue, the sharing will have to keep continuing, especially when helping each other on accessing and reaching out to libraries and archival material, and also sharing with each other. I know people share their photographs and their own digitized materials because this is what we're going to have to learn doing. Again, I'm very pessimistic. I'm not sure that in my lifetime as a researcher I will see the inside of an archive in Kazan or Moscow, for that matter. So we'll, again, as we said it before, we'll have to learn of new archives. We'll have to learn how to read those archives. We'll have to learn new languages, and that goes back to who is going to fund these courses. I think it's very important that institutions keep that in mind, but also keep talking and developing those questions when, not if, but when we will be able to access those archives that are closed and inaccessible to us now, because that's going to happen, and we will not be able, and we should not address them the way we addressed them until recently. So we have to keep talking about in archival studies that there is a lot of discussion going there, and I think this is one of the things that we will have to keep developing until that's out. But other than that, yes, absolutely, I believe that talking, sharing, discussing, decentralizing, and deconstructing our own research and thoughts and narratives is very important, for the very sake of, again, not permitting history being, or philosophy, for that matter, being instrumentalized, and that we don't go back to those very terrible isms that are recurring.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this really engaging conversation. And now I think it's time.
Hi, thank you so much for this really stimulating conversation. I'm Leah. I'm a graduate student from Princeton University, and I'm here for 2 months of research at Slavica. And I was just so fascinated by your conversation because I studied the same time period, so late 19th century, and I'm also, I would say, an intellectual historian, cultural historian, and I'm particularly interested in the influence of Eastern ideas and philosophy, specifically Buddhism and Hinduism, on the fin de siècle Russian culture. So I guess my question for you is whether in your research you encountered sort of these Eastern influences, especially ideas from Buddhism that, you know, A is not A could also be not A. So kind of this non-dualistic view of reality. And this is probably more for Liisa, kind of this phenomenology and how in the early 20th century, of course, probably there's a genealogy in Western philosophy, but probably some ideas from Buddhism and, you know, the entire German Orientology, maybe there were some inspirations. And then the question, I guess for both of you, but I'm specifically interested in hearing Daniela's opinion on this kind of methodology on history of knowledge, because in a way I also do history of knowledge, but I'm trying to understand whether we can speak of history of Eastern knowledge or Russian knowledge, whether it makes sense to add these kind of geographical understandings of knowledge, especially because in the conversation, a few terms were circulated. So Russian philosophy, Russian thought, intellectual history, history of ideas, history of knowledge. And I wonder if we have a methodology in maybe separating these different approaches or somehow combining them, because if we look at European intellectual history, right, we have Cambridge School, Kozelek's Begriffsgeschichte, conceptual history, and maybe Samuel Moyn, social history of ideas, and all of these. And I wonder how it looks like in the Russian field. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very multi-layered question, maybe like many questions in one. I think you might start answering that, or do we have more questions for now? I think I can give the microphone to you and you can...
Yes, thank you. Wonderful question. Actually, we were talking before that I love methodologies. And so yeah, about going back to the concept, the use of the Russian thought, I think it must be revised. Of course, we have to think about why we call it Russian and what is Russian about that thought. Definitely I said, okay, I studied Russian thought, but then I never approached my research as strictly like Russian thought. I look at it again as a dialogue, as an intra-imperial dialogue on knowledge production. That said, no, I don't believe there is something particular, again, Russian, whatever we mean by Russian, to be developed in these methodologies of knowledge production. Absolutely not. I don't see them how, because if we start this kind of like sort of ethnic, national-based essentialization also in research, I think that we narrow down the possibility of like reading the past and developing these narratives of the past. So no, I do not believe there is anything specific Russian about this knowledge production process now, especially because these scientists I'm studying, so I'm just going to refer to my own project, they very much are in conversation with what they consider to be the West at the time, and that is Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and so on and so forth. So the knowledge they produced was in the empire, and again, a very different empire in different points of the empire. They produced that knowledge together and somehow they try to, I don't know, standardize it because they talked necessarily to those again, in the West, that West that they talked about. So it was important for them to be, in conversation with those people. And about the knowledge, what helps me, for instance, is, again, not only studying the, again, these are male scientists in my case, what they talked about at these congresses and what they, produced in these publications, but actually look at how they produce this knowledge on the ground, let's say at the bedside of the patient. And again, there is nothing specific, in my opinion, Russian about it. Just reading my sources also with a comparative angle with other studies. Again, there is none, and I don't think it's a useful sort of direction to take in developing our methodologies in this case.
I think
okay, yeah. There is only one commentary on chat that is indicating that Buddhism has a connection to Kansalliskirjasto in Russia.
So now we
can I do you have time to answer this question quickly, because
yes, please. Yeah,
because
sure,
it was a great question. I really liked it. And so in a sense, what I still find interesting and puzzling about Speth is that as I said, there seems to be something different from Husserl. What is this difference? And the only way I could figure it out somehow is it somehow happens on the level of already logic, as you said. There's some difference there. And I'm not much of a logician at all, but I met recently a researcher who also works in the States, who had a project, a PhD project on Russian logics, or rather different logics or logicians across the empire. And she studied also archival research. She just started rediscovering these logicians that have barely been touched earlier, started looking into their works, and started noticing similarities between their thinking. And she came up with this concept of what was it now? Okay, I lost the definition, but the idea that it was perhaps not a school, but there was certainly something going on between these thinkers. There was something it was some kind of college, she called it, of individual thinkers. And it was a non-Western logic in some way. It was, and in this sense, as you said, it was a non-binary logic in some sense. So this is very interesting that you ask about this, and I'm hoping to work towards this a little bit myself. I don't know whether it has anything to do with Buddhism, but there is a difference. In what concerns the schools of intellectual history, this is new to me, honestly, and I struggle with it a little bit. Also because Russian philosophy so often itself is historical thought. Again, it's Russian philosophy being history of Russian philosophy, their own works are histories of Russian philosophy. So you dive into them and you start working in this intellectual history, but you don't really know how to, what would be the right methodology. This is something that I think needs to be developed further in this field.
Thank you. I think we might have time for one quick question, and then we might, take a couple of minutes to switch the speakers on the stage, because it's very back-to-back.
So now I have been told that it should be a quick question, and that is also a form of censorship. But I just wanted to say that I was very happy to note that you at least had respect for this young guest from Princeton, and you did not interrupt her well-contextualized question, which the panelist particularly remarked was a very good question, and I hope that it will serve as a beacon to everybody how academic discussion should happen in this university. And I'm very sure that the Tsar across the street would today be very happy to see that finally in Slavika, at least one person from Princeton could speak their mind freely, and somebody who is an expert in Russian philosophy was able to appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So once again, thank you so much for Daniela, Liisa, and the audience.